There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. Just a heads up that this episode contains discussions of physical violence against children. If this subject's a tough one for you, please take care when listening. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more vulnerable person in the world than a newborn baby who makes it earthside before they're fully ready. Those tiny little fingers and toes, looking like they belong to a doll, not an actual real-life human being. Their tiny lives relying on specialty equipment that keeps them warm and safe, while their not-yet-ready lungs learn to breathe and grow, and their not-yet-ready little bodies develop enough to hopefully one day go home with their mum and dad. For the parents of these little lives, it's a time full of worry and relief. Relief that they made it to the outside world at all. Worry that they may not be strong enough to stay there. But for a year from June 2015, a group of mothers who found themselves delivering these not-yet-ready babies at the Countess of Chester Hospital in the UK would find among the incredible men and women working in the neonatal ICU an angel of darkness lurked. This monster wasn't hiding under the bed. She didn't even look slightly scary or even intimidating. She was a blonde-haired, brown-eyed, pretty woman who preyed on the most vulnerable. Lucy Letby had studied hard to become a nurse and was proud of the qualifications she'd achieved that allowed her to tend to the most at-risk children who landed in room 1 of the Countess's neonatal unit. Those who trained her said she was a nice, normal girl, never showing a single sign of the evil that she would eventually unleash on more than a dozen families over those 12 months. As night would fall, Lucy Letby would look over the edge of the cribs where her helpless victims lay attached to monitors, their tiny hearts beating fast like only a newborn's can. She would take their vitals. She would ensure their paperwork was up to date. And sometimes she would inject air directly into their feeding tubes, creating a build-up in a body so small it would destroy their barely intact diaphragm. As the babies lay stricken, barely hanging on to life, their little bodies would flash a purple rash, some describing how it would look like they could see something under the child's skin as it raced through their system, taking life as it went. Some parents even watched on as doctors and nurses attempted to bring their little hearts back, but will now forever have the image of a tiny chest being pumped to no avail. Twins lost siblings, triplets too. Some children have a legacy of a disability. Mums and dads had their hearts torn from them as Lucy Letby's reign of terror continued, seemingly unchecked, despite the concerns raised by her colleagues.
Jailed for life, never to be released. Former nurse Lucy Letby murdered 7 babies in her care and tried to kill 6 more. A judge delivering the harshest punishment possible.
This was a cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions. You have no remorse.
How could someone do this? How could you target a life that had barely begun? Will we ever know the motive of Britain's worst modern-day child serial killer? I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Over the last few weeks, Lucy Letby's name has been splashed over news sites alongside words like baby killer, killer nurse and serial killer. Last week, the 33-year-old was found guilty of murdering 7 newborns and attempting to kill 6 other babies who were under her care. Letby was working as a nurse in the neonatal ward of the Countess of Chester Hospital in northwestern England when she committed the crimes between 2015 and 2016. She was responsible for caring for premature and vulnerable babies. But from January 2015, hospital staff noticed a significant rise in the number of babies dying and suffering serious collapses in the unit. Police and medical experts were called in for a large-scale investigation into the situation, and they discovered one common factor linking these occurrences: Lucy Letby. After her third arrest in 2020, Letby pleaded not guilty to all charges in court, but she was convicted through evidence, including a series of medical records, texts, staffing schedules, and handwritten notes and diaries in which she all but admitted her guilt. She now holds the title as only the fourth woman in UK history to receive a whole life sentence. Our guest today, broadcast journalist Caroline Cheetham, has been documenting Letby's trial for the past year on her podcast, The Trial of Lucy Letby. She joins us now to walk us through this case. So, Caroline, can we go back to the beginning here? What kind of young person was Lucy Letby like? I know that later documents, police have described her somewhat as a beige person, but do we have any insight as to what she was like growing up and whether we saw any signs that she was capable of doing what she did?
Oh gosh, I mean, no signs whatsoever. I should say that at the very, very beginning. As normal can be, Claire, actually. Grew up really loved, only child of her parents. They lived in pretty normal house in a cul-de-sac in Hereford. Very small village, actually, a bit like Chester, to be honest. It's a sort of a walled city and really normal upbringing. We know that from fairly early age, she wanted to be a nurse. So she chose her subjects at GCSE and A-level to fit that path. And we know she was the first person in her family to go to university. She went to the University of Chester, where she studied nursing. But to go back to your original question, no, absolutely no signs that anyone can see, which is, I suppose, if we fast forward to now, which is the one question the police think they haven't answered. Why? There's nothing that we can see, nothing came out in the trial, nothing our backgrounders have found that in 2015 or before, anything happened to cause this unbelievable course of action that she took.
Can you give us an idea of what the Countess Hospital is like? Is it a big hospital? Is it busy? Would there be hundreds of babies in the neonatal unit at any one time? What does it actually look like, her place of work?
It's a standard regional hospital in a city. So it deals with many, many patients across North Wales and the northwest of England. About 3,000 babies a year are born at the Countess, and a very small proportion of those are dealt with in the neonatal unit. So then you've got, obviously preemies, premature babies, babies born with infections, babies born with illness who just need a little bit of extra help. At that point in 2015, the Countess was not what you'd call one of the hospitals that took the most serious cases. They could take cases, babies born up to 27 weeks. Obviously, other more specialist units take babies born much earlier than that. So the Countess at that point, 2015, could take babies born at 27 weeks. Now, later on, after all of this transpired in 2016, 2017, they actually downgraded and they started to take babies over 30 weeks. But at that point, it was 27 weeks. So you had a range of conditions. They could deal with pretty poorly babies, but actually the most poorly, most premature, most fragile babies went to different units across the region and not to the Countess.
Was this Lucy's first place of employment in a neonatal ICU unit like this? Had she worked at other hospitals beforehand?
During her studies at Chester University, she did a placement at Liverpool Women's Hospital and also a placement at Chester. So she was in and out of both units for some time. That dated back to 2011, when she started her nursing career, if you like, in those placements. And as I say, about sort of 20, 25 miles away at Liverpool Women's, she worked there as part of her placement opportunities. But her main job, if you like, when she started her career after she qualified and done all her placements, was at Chester.
How long had she been working there before the first cases that were brought before the courts, as we've just heard in this 10-month trial? Had she been there long before these started?
Well, she had. She'd been there a long time. As I said, most of her career from 2011 was spent at Chester, and a small proportion of her time early on was spent at Liverpool Women's. And to go to your point, she had been at Chester for a very long time, for most of her career, which is why the police are now going to go back to the very beginning of her career just to double check whether any other babies that may have passed through her care or been in any way looked after by her across her nursing career from 2011 could have been impacted. But she worked at Chester for the vast majority of her career. And in fact, you may have seen the pictures of her, Claire, which is her with a baby grow. That is her being the face of the campaign for funding for that neonatal unit. That was the way she was regarded.
How was she regarded by her colleagues in the hospital before all of this came to light? Was she well liked? Was she popular? Was she a good colleague?
So I think that she was considered to be a good colleague. We heard in the trial and subsequently actually that she was always the one to do the more unpopular shifts, the night shifts, the weekends. If they needed somebody at short notice, she would come in. This unit, I think it was her life. And what we knew was that whether she was in work or whether she wasn't in work, she knew exactly who was on that unit. There was text messages around what was happening on the unit, even on her days off. So she was very invested. And I think the terrible irony, Claire, is that she was seen as a safe pair of hands because she tended to do all the courses that got her more qualified. She appeared to be ambitious. She wanted to work with the most poorly children. She wanted to be in nursery 1, which was their intensive care unit. That was the one that she felt, she said, she would be most needed and most effective. She said she was bored when she was in nurseries 3 and 4, which were the ones where the babies needed less help and were not far off going home. So she was often the one to offer, to do the extra shifts, to come in at short notice, to cover when a nurse was going on a break, to take her own babies in a certain nursery and look after babies in another nursery. So I think, yes, a safe pair of hands at the time. Your other question was she popular? What we heard was that she had friends. She went out. She was into salsa dancing. She did salsa dancing with another nurse. She had housewarming parties. I mean, the normal course of work relationships. It seemed really, really normal. But what we did hear in the trial was that she was prone to reporting colleagues if she felt things weren't right. She was often the one to sort of, I don't know whether dob them in is the right phrase, but she was often the one to report anything going wrong. Not a job's worth, but certainly one who wanted the rules to be followed and adhered to. So that came out in the trial. But, what we know also from the trial was that many, many, many of her nursing colleagues supported her. They backed her. They did not think she was capable of any of this. So I think probably they saw her as a really competent, reliable nurse.
How do you describe Lucy Letby?
She seemed keen. She was fairly conscientious. She was quiet.
I would describe her as a person as being beige. She had a normal friendship group, a family. She had a normal social life, everything you would expect somebody in their 20s to do. She used that normality and the trust that she obtained through that as a cover for the crimes that she committed, which is really hard to put those two things together and accept that somebody had committed those crimes, but also that there isn't something outrageous about them, and that actually she was operating in plain sight because she was so normal.
She was the beneficiary of this confirmation bias. People just could not rationalise how a nurse would be living with that extent of betrayal of the confidence that was placed in her, perverting her skills, weaponising the tools that she used.
In June 2015, no one would have been concerned when 2 9-week early twins come into her care, which are referred to as baby A and baby B in court documents. None of the children are identified at this stage. Would she have been their primary carer whilst they were in the ICU?
I'll just whiz you back to how it works in the intensive care unit at Chester. So when babies come in, they're designated a nurse. Not permanently, as in the whole time they're there, because clearly nurses go on and off shift. But as the sort of shift happens, or the night shift come in, or the day shift come in, the nurses are designated certain babies. So with baby A and baby B, they were twins. And as you say, born at 31 weeks. And they were brother and sister. And they were fragile, both weighing just over 3 pounds, so very, very tiny. Their mother had a sort of autoimmune disease. That was why they were deemed to be fragile and not at risk, but certainly needed extra special attention. So baby A was put into nursery 1, which was the intensive care unit, and was indeed being looked after by Lucy Letby. She was his designated nurse. Baby B, his sister, who was actually a little bit less robust than her brother, needed a bit more help with her breathing when she was born. She was put into the same intensive care unit, and her designated nurse, certainly the night she was attacked, was not Lucy Letby. But on that particular shift, she stepped in to help another colleague who was her designated nurse.
Well, let's talk about what went down with baby A, because from all reports, he was doing quite well up until the point where he collapsed. What actually happened during the health crisis and his eventual passing?
He was small. He weighed about 3 pounds and 12 ounces, which is tiny. And he was in that intensive care room. But Claire, very soon after he was born, he was breathing on his own, and the nurses considered him to be stable. But then there was a night shift, and Lucy Letby was his designated nurse on this particular night shift. Now, on the evening that he collapsed, Lucy Letby was on her own in the nursery with him, and he'd been doing really well. I mean, as I said, he was fragile. He didn't weigh very much, but there seemed to be no reason whatsoever that he stopped breathing. And we heard in awful detail that the crash team were bleeped, the senior registrar on duty and the team rushed into the room, and the doctors and nurses tried for a very, very long time to bring him back. And we heard awful, moving testimony from his mum, who was on the postnatal ward upstairs with her own mum, so the baby's grandma, and the dad. And they were rushed down to the unit, and she was sobbing, begging the doctors to save him. And in the end, they couldn't. And it was the grandma that said to her daughter, "You need to let him go." And it was so sudden that they did carry out a post-mortem because they couldn't really explain what had happened with that. Initially, they were worried that it might have been the mum's medical condition that could have led to a problem. But that didn't come through in the post-mortem. There was no real reason that they could find in the post-mortem. But that was the start of what we heard throughout this case, was that when baby A crashed, when he collapsed and they had to do CPR, they noticed rashes on his skin, on his torso, on his tummy, flitting. They were called sort of brown, purple, flitting rashes. And many of the doctors and nurses who were giving evidence said they'd never seen this sort of rash before. And these were very experienced doctors and nurses. They'd never seen it before. And they just couldn't quite understand it. And it later transpired that this rash was later deemed to be the result of an air embolus, so air being trapped, air being pumped into either baby's bloodstream or down their lung lines. And in this particular case of baby A, they say that he had air pumped into his bloodstream and he died. Now, the following day, you can imagine the parents of baby A and baby B were utterly frantic. And because at that point, they actually weren't sure if the mum's condition may have been somehow inadvertently led to that deterioration, there was real concern for baby B. And that meant that baby B was barely left alone. The mum and the dad wouldn't leave her side. She was utterly panic-stricken that something would happen. Not because at that point there was any suspicions, just because they just wanted 24/7 eyes on their daughter. And also because the doctors and nurses did not know at that point what had caused her brother to collapse and die the night before. But at a point which baby B was left alone very temporarily, her alarm started to sound. Baby B was being looked after by a different nurse at that point, and Lucy Letby was not her designated nurse, but she did help that designated nurse with a bag of feed, to give baby B a bag of feed at just after midnight, and she also took her blood gases. And it was 25 minutes later when that alarm sounded at 12:25, and she stopped breathing. And again, similar to baby A, they crash bleeped the team. They came in, and again, we heard the most awful moving testimony from her mother, who again was called by the nurses. They ran up to the ward to grab mum, who was recovering from the birth. And she just said, my heart sank. Not my baby. Not again. The team rushed in to help her, and actually she stabilised within 10 to 15 minutes. But again, what we heard from the registrar, a very experienced registrar, was that rash. That rash had appeared again on baby B. Blotches, pink, purpley red blotches that were widespread. And they were told that they would come up and within seconds they'd go again, and then they'd reappear, and then they got better and subsided. And then baby B started to wriggle and breathe. And within about half an hour, her natural colour started to come through and she recovered. I mean, I think what we heard in the victim impact statements in court was just how manipulated the parents felt, because she was utterly sympathetic, dedicated, helping them.
How was Lucy Letby interacting with the parents after they've lost their child? Because I understand she was quite a comfort to them in their grief after their baby son was lost.
Yeah, I mean, we heard time and time again, it became clear that she was what they called the common denominator. She was always there when they collapsed, often there when they died, or certainly before and after. Her presence was always felt. And that was one of the reasons that they began to become suspicious. And we heard over and over again just how close to those families that she got. So she would do things like take their hand and footprints after they had died. She would do things like take a lock of hair. She would do things like create a memory box for the families, for the parents. She would do things like dress them. With one of the sets of babies, 2 of 3 triplets, she dressed them in matching outfits and brought them in. One of the most devastating pieces of evidence I think that I heard in this whole trial was the victim impact statement from one of the parents, who said that she was utterly haunted by the fact that her child died and had been buried in a shawl. That shawl had been chosen by Lucy Letby. And that knowledge that her child had been buried in a garment that Lucy Letby had chosen was now haunting to that mum, because, well, you can imagine, there's nothing she can do about that. And yet her child has that shawl now. So we heard that a lot, that She was very involved in the care after collapses and after deaths. In one of the cases of baby M, who collapsed and survived, Lucy Letby was very, very involved in his recovery, very involved in helping the team to resuscitate him, and very involved then in his aftercare. And we spoke to the mum of baby M. She is the mum of baby M and L, twin boys who recovered, who were both attacked by Lucy Letby. And she said that she was so helpful. She was so helpful, so involved in their care after the event as well. So whether they survived or whether they died, she was very, very close to these families and became a real constant for them in the events afterwards. Some of the families found that to be a comfort, as we heard. Others found it to be odd, interfering. In one of the cases that we heard, one of the children took a long time to die. They knew that he was going to die, and they were just cuddling their son for hours. And she wouldn't leave them alone. She was designated to be the nurse for a different baby at that point. She wasn't even looking after those parents at that point. A different nurse was. They were in the family room, cuddling their son, and she just kept coming in and out. Phrases like, "You've said your goodbyes, now put him in here," bringing a cot in. And they were hurt by some of that. So overly interfering, overly involved in those really precious, awful moments, I think came through time and time again in the trial.
The investigations after she was finally arrested did also find that she would often Facebook stalk the families of the children that had passed away.
Yeah, this was strange. And this, again, was a common occurrence that came through time and time again, that Lucy Letby, not even in the moments of looking after the families or in the moments after, but months and years afterwards, she would look them up on Facebook. I mean, we heard that she looked one parent up on Christmas Day on Facebook. We've heard subsequently, Claire, actually, that for many of the families, she would look them up on Facebook, would become friends with them on Facebook. For families not involved in this case, whose children survived and were looked after by Lucy Letby, of course, now they may well be part of different charges to come, but we've heard from families who say, yeah, she became my friend on Facebook, she commented on things I was posting, but certainly for some of the babies who died, she would look them up on Facebook, the parents, and, you know, the prosecution said this was strange, this was odd behaviour for months and years later to be looking up parents on Facebook is at the very least odd.
Now, you mentioned before that Lucy Letby's involvement in all of these incidents does start to look suspicious. So over like a 2-week period, 3 babies die and 1 baby survives. So babies A through D, only one of them survive. And for an ICU unit, this is unusual because premature babies die, not all of them survive. But these numbers are starting to stir suspicions. Who comes forward with these suspicions, and does anything happen? Does anyone look into Lucy's proximity to all of these at that stage?
So between June and July 2015, it was just over 3 weeks actually, just less than a month. As you said, there were 3 deaths and 1 unexpected collapse. In all 4 of those cases, though, those babies deteriorated in an unexpected way. And I think the numbers was obviously a part of it, but it was the unexpected nature. So for a neonatal unit like Chester, their figures showed that they had approximately 3 deaths a year. So when you've got 3 deaths in the course of a month, doctors and nurses are starting to say, this feels high, this feels worrying. They needed to be checking what was happening. Every death is checked. Every death is examined, of course. And at first there was a fear that, was there an infection on the ward? Was there something they weren't seeing? And certainly for a long time, there were genuinely thoughts that this must be medical. So what is the medical cause and how can we solve it? How can we get to the bottom of it? And it was Dr. Stephen Breary who, within that month, started to say, I'm not happy with these numbers and also the nature of what's happening. Dr. Stephen Brewery was in charge of the neonatal unit. It's his unit. Dr. Ravi Jairam was in charge of the children's unit next door. So the two of them worked very closely together, along with many, many other consultants. So in the course of that first month, there were concerns, but not that there was something sinister or suspicious, just that we need to know what's happening on our unit because these figures don't look good.
On the unit, there were typically up to 3 deaths a year. But in 2015, they had that number in the month of June alone, and the pattern continued with babies dying or coming close to death.
Fairly quickly, actually, over the summer, coming towards the autumn, they then started to say, actually, we've ruled out lots of other things, but the one thing we can't rule out is the fact that this one person is here every time. Lucy Letby became what they called at that point, Claire, an association. So when they're looking at all of the graphs and all of the data, and they're examining what's happening, who's on duty, what are the similar facts, this isn't a sort of odd way to do it. It's a perfectly normal way to do it, that you're looking at who's on duty. And she was on duty every time. And what we heard initially was that the doctors were saying, gosh, is she okay? Poor Lucy, because she's on duty every time. This is terrible for her. What's happening?
I spoke to her and said how tired and upset she must be after 2 days of this. And I hoped that she was going to have a restful weekend. And she turned to me and said, no, I'm back on shift tomorrow. The other staff were very traumatised by all of this. We were crumbling before your eyes almost, and she was quite happy and confident to come into work.
Now, I think that became a little more worrying when Stephen Brewery called in a neonatologist from a different hospital, a different expert pair of eyes on the unit. And again, he ruled out pretty much everything apart from her. And he said, I can't find anything. The only thing I'd say is this person's on duty every time. So by October 2016, the doctors were starting to knock on the door of the managers, the head of nursing, the medical director, and saying, we're worried about this. Can you help us? And as we heard in court, and as we're hearing constantly now post the trial, and I think this will certainly form part of any inquiry that comes, those managers, hospital managers, senior leaders took a very long time to do anything. And I think initially the doctors were told by the director of nursing, Alison Kelly, let's wait and see. Let's see what happens. Then there was another call to the senior leaders and nothing happened. In fact, they didn't even hear back for 3 months. So what we realised throughout the trial, and since speaking to all the consultants on the ward and on the podcast, we've spoken to Dr. John Gibbs, who was very much part of this and very much part of the consultants raising these concerns. It just took a very long time for them to do anything. And then when it became more urgent and the doctors were really banging on the door, they just didn't want to believe it. We told that they had a closed mind to the fact that this could be happening, that yes, it was unthinkable. Yes, it's beyond anything that we've seen before, but we now need for you to start thinking that this could be right because there is nothing else that ties all of these babies together.
Well, while those people are saying, let's just wait and see, more babies are dying. And there's one case in particular, child E, who passes away in August 2015, where the mother says she walks down from the ward to the unit and she can hear her son, one of another set of twins, she can hear her son screaming from inside the nursery. She said it's a sound unlike anything she's ever heard come out of a baby before. What does she discover when she goes into the nursery?
Yeah, so baby E's mum was coming down to the neonatal unit because she was bringing breast milk. So she was passionate that, yes, her son was fragile. I mean, actually, I should say he's a twin. Baby E and baby F were twin boys, and they were born 10 weeks early in August 2015. So what you've got, if you follow the timeline, is you've got these 4 babies who collapsed and 3 of them died between June and July. Then, if you like, a lull in July. In August, baby E and baby F are born 10 weeks early. Now, they should never have even been at the Countess. They should have been born at Liverpool Women's Hospital. Actually, when Mum went into labour, it was full. And because they were born early, and Mum felt very passionately that she couldn't do much for them because they were in neonatal, they were in incubators, they were being looked after and they were ventilated. She felt she couldn't do much for them. And she felt very passionately that she wanted to. So she wanted them to have breast milk. So she was expressing. And on this particular night in August, she was going down to the neonatal unit at about 9 o'clock. And what she could hear from the corridor as she's going towards his nursery with her breast milk was him screaming. And what we heard was that was a scream that should never have come out of a baby. It was haunting, that scream. He was in pain. And when she went to him in his cot, in his incubator, he had blood around his mouth. And Lucy Letby, she was around the unit, and the mum immediately said, "What on earth's wrong with him? What's going on?" And she said it was a scream that she'd never heard before. Lucy Letby was working at the workstation nearby, at the nurses' station, which was just outside in the corridor. And she came in and said, he's fine. She told baby E's mum that it would be the feeding tube that was in his throat that would be rubbing. And that's what was causing the problem. And she encouraged her to go back up to the ward and that she would sort him out. Mum did go back up to the ward very reluctantly, but what we heard was that she made a phone call to her husband very soon and said that she was really worried about that. And that call was logged. So later on, when Lucy Letby tried to say that the mum's visit was much later to what the prosecution said was to try to cover her tracks, that call was an indication that the mum was right about that timing, that it had been about 9 o'clock. What happened later was that he collapsed and he was bleeding an awful lot and he lost an awful lot of blood from his body. In fact, he lost a quarter of all the blood in his body, and the doctor on charge, a man called Dr. Hartness, was traumatised actually by this. He tried to save him. He tried to resuscitate him, but he couldn't. And he died. Despite having an awful lot of CPR, he died.
And what do the prosecutors say actually happened to him?
So he died primarily because he was injected with air. And again, that was another air embolus that was injected into his system. Again, one of the key moments in the trial for this baby was that there was no post-mortem carried out on baby E. So the prosecution had no post-mortem evidence, had no records to say what had caused his death, what led to that death. So in court, the doctor, one of the doctors who had spoken to the parents at the time and actually had not advised them to have a post-mortem, I think that doctor just felt that they'd been through enough. This baby had died in terrible circumstances. The parents had been there, had witnessed so much of what had happened in this particular case that the doctor didn't advise a post-mortem. And in court, she turned to those parents when she was at the witness stand and apologised for not advising them to have a post-mortem, because obviously in that particular case, it would have been more conclusive. As it turned out, the jury were convinced by the evidence that they did hear in this case and did convict Lucy Letby of murdering baby E by injecting him with air and inflicting an injury into his windpipe and airway.
Now, baby E's twin brother, baby F, she decides to attack in a different way for the first time.
Yeah, baby F was the first baby in this case to be injected with insulin. The doctors couldn't quite explain what was happening with baby F because his blood sugar levels were just not right. His blood sugar was incredibly low, but the blood test coming through was showing that his insulin was incredibly high. And it just didn't really make sense. What later transpired was that it wasn't naturally produced insulin that was causing his blood sugar to be low. It was synthetic insulin. So that means it's insulin that's being given to him, not insulin that his body is naturally producing. And for a while, the doctors couldn't explain what was happening with baby F. They knew he was deteriorating. They knew his blood results were not right. They knew his blood sugar was not right, and they couldn't stabilise it no matter what they did. They couldn't seem to stabilise it. They kept giving him these bags of dextrose to try and rectify his blood sugar. But his blood sugar levels kept on spiking. And what they heard and what we realised in court was that the reason for that was because those bags of dextrose, which are sort of nutrients given to the babies and given to baby F, had themselves been poisoned with insulin. And we heard it would only take a tiny teaspoon of insulin into those bags to cause those blood sugar levels to be so erratic. And one of the key moments, I think, and one of the things that we heard on the podcast from Dr. Gibbs, and one of his regrets really, was that by the time the blood results had come through about the insulin, which showed that the insulin in his body was synthetic. So it was being given, it wasn't being created in his body. He had recovered. So they weren't ignored, but the significance of that result was not properly monitored and not properly followed through, because by the time they come through, because of the delays in blood test results going off and coming back, by that point baby F had recovered and seemed to be much, much better. And the parents were desperate to get him off the unit and back to a district hospital near to their own house. They didn't follow through on those results. And had they done so, they would have realised that his blood sugar was crashing to dangerously low levels because he was being injected with synthetic insulin, which was in the bags. So that point, baby F, was a key moment where I think for many of the doctors on the unit, she could possibly have been stopped, because that was a change in her method. First time we saw it, she obviously did use this method again later on with baby L. But in this particular case, at this particular point, which was August 2015, the worry now, the fear now, the point that worries the doctors is we could have stopped her then if we'd picked up on those blood results, and we didn't, because of the time delays, of the fact baby F had recovered, because of the way it sort of comes through into the system and the way it's delivered. It's not exactly obvious what they're looking at straight away. And again, that could be one for the inquiry where those results are quicker and they're a lot more clear what people are seeing.
Caroline, what's the legacy for those children who survived Lucy Letby's attacks? Because there are some, they would be 7, 8 years old now, and for some of them it's been a pretty tough road.
Incredibly tough. We heard in this case that Lucy Letby was found guilty of 7 attempted murders on 6 babies. So on one of those babies, she tried to kill more than once. Some of these babies live with lifelong, terrible injuries, terrible disabilities, which will impact their families for years and years to come. One of the babies, a baby girl, is nonverbal. She can't feed herself. She's fed by a tube. She's in a wheelchair. And again, I've alluded to these before, but probably the most moving day in court was the victim impact statements from the parents. And the dad in that particular case gave the most incredible victim impact statement, where he said his daughter would never graduate from school, never have a first kiss, probably never marry. And he said she would be in her chair forever. That's just one of the horrendous impacts of this case. She was hurt so badly that she lives with lifelong injuries, as do many of the children. It's not easy to know whether in every case the children have injuries and diagnosis because of the attacks. The family certainly believe so. For baby L, who was poisoned with insulin, that child now is 7, and his mum told us that every night he sweats. Now, she has no idea whether those night sweats are linked to that attack. The doctors don't know. And I think for many of them, they live with the worry that they don't yet know. Some of these children are not meeting their milestones of their peers. So is that because of the attack? The parents certainly believe so.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with journalist Caroline Cheetham about the conviction of one of Britain's most prolific serial child killers, Lucy Letby. What eventually leads to Lucy Letby being taken off that ward? Because as we've discussed, there's been reviews, informal reviews. There are so many children dying, way more than what should be in a neonatal ICU, of unexplained circumstances. She is connected to most of them. I know some of them, there was discussed whether she had done things and then gone off shift and then other people had to deal with the aftermath of. But what actually leads to her being taken off the ward? Because it's quite a long time she's allowed to keep going.
In the course of June 2015 to July 2016, over the course of a year, basically, 12 babies died on that unit. And we know that she was charged with 7 counts of murder. Now, we've been told that at least one of those other deaths was natural because the doctor involved is aware of that death and had talked to us about it and said that was a natural death. The others, we don't know. But what we do know for now is that she was convicted of 7 murders, charged with 7 murders and convicted of 7 murders. As you allude to, Claire, this all comes to a head in June, July 2016. So this has all been going on for a year. And as we know, doctors are concerned. This unit has become an awful place to work. Doctors and nurses do not know what they're going to find when they walk into the door. Almost a fear and a dread of babies collapsing in ways that they can't explain, can't predict, and can't always resolve. Lucy Letby has been in Ibiza in June 2016, and she comes back. The night before she comes back, she sends a text to somebody, to a friend, that says she's going to be back with a bang. Now, in the unit at that point, everyone was very excited because a set of triplets who had been naturally conceived had been born at the Countess. Now, this is incredibly rare. Naturally conceived, identical triplets are incredibly rare, and I mean millions to one. So the Countess and the staff were excited to have these triplets on their unit. But what happens in June 2016 is Lucy Letby comes back onto the unit after her holiday, and she is in charge of baby O and baby P, who are 2 of the 3 triplets who've been born on the unit. And within hours of her being on that unit, baby O dies, and he dies again of an air embolus. The following day, his brother, baby P, also dies, again of an air embolus. And at this point, you have senior doctors begging managers to do something. You have one consultant saying, get the 3rd triplet off this unit now to save his life, basically. You have Dr. John Gibbs saying this was the tipping point. This was the point where they were saying no more. And you have Stephen Breary ringing a senior manager at home and saying, Lucy Letby must not come to work tomorrow. And the senior manager says, she's coming to work tomorrow. And Dr. Breary says, well, then it's on your conscience. The following day, Lucy Letby came to work, and baby Q, not one of the triplets, a different baby, also falls ill unexpectedly. He recovers. And Lucy Letby was charged with attempted murder in his case, but not convicted. But that's the point. After baby Q, who was part of these charges, but again, she wasn't convicted of that particular charge. After that, June 2016, she is then removed off the unit. But you can imagine by this point, the feelings and the fear and the culture on this ward was, well, it was described as utterly toxic. A them and us culture, almost a sort of consultants versus Lucy Letby culture. And at that point, she's moved off the unit. And I should add that we were told by Dr. Gibbs that between that moment and now, there's been one death on that unit.
So they've realised that obviously she's made a difference. Her not being on that ward makes a difference. Do they investigate from this point on? Because I know she's arrested a couple of times in the years to come, in 2018 and 2019, but no charges seem to have been laid. I know they search her home, but charges don't get laid until 2020. What's happening in all of those years in between?
Yeah, I'll just walk you through that time frame because, as you said, there were inquiries, there were investigations, and what was taking all of this time? What was happening at the hospital was that the hospital were doing various medical investigations. They had neonatologists coming in, they had different doctors coming in. So these investigations were taking place over this period, you know, not a detective-led investigation, not a police-led investigation. The consultants were saying, we believe there is something sinister happening, but another doctor from a different unit is not capable of investigating that. So they're looking at medical causes. And of course, nothing's coming up because there wasn't a medical cause. Things are recommended, so changes on the unit are happening. And at that point, they did downgrade to become a hospital that only took babies beyond 30 weeks. So they didn't take those more premature babies at 27 weeks. So some changes were made medically. But for another year between 2016 and 2017, again, they don't want to call the police in. The consultants are asking for police to be called in. The medical directors, the managers are saying, no, we're not calling the police in. We don't think it's sinister. At this point, Lucy Letby is off the ward, but she's still working. And she's been moved to an office job. I mean, some people might say, ironically, to the patient risk unit, but she's off the ward. So in that sense, the danger, as the consultants would see it, is much reduced. And of course, the figures would speak for themselves to say that that sort of unexpected collapses and deaths did stop happening. It's another year before the police are called in. And the reason that actually happens is because these deaths and concerns start being raised at a panel, a sort of infant mortality panel, where a police officer sits on this panel. And because these deaths started to be raised at this panel and the concerns of the consultants about a person on the ward, at this point, the chair of the panel and the police officer say, actually, you have no choice. You have to take this to the police. So it's then another year, 2017, and the police are then called in. It then takes another year before Lucy Letby is arrested in 2018. And that's because what we found out in this investigation was whatever the police had been told, and the police had been told of the consultants' concerns about Lucy Letby and what had been happening, they went right back to the beginning. And I certainly found their investigation to be fascinating. You know, how do you investigate all of these issues, deaths, collapses, all at once without one tainting the other? You know, without it becoming a sort of group think, if you like. So what they then did was then appoint a detective to a baby. And they had them work individually. So this was 17 different investigations that took place, all of them individually. And those detectives didn't share any information. They didn't overlap. And only the senior investigating officer was aware of how each investigation was progressing. And then at certain points, he'd bring them all back in to a meeting and they'd start to share. This was quite some way down the line. And if you're asking nurses to recount shifts and you're looking at swipe data and you're looking at nursing notes and you're looking at handwritten notes and you're looking at text messages and you're trying to pull all of this incredibly complicated jigsaw puzzle together, that's going to take time. So at some point further down the line, he brought them all back together again, each detective, and they started to share. And as one said, well, in my baby's case, the parents went for some food. Lucy Letby was on shift. And then the collapse happened. Another detective would say, oh, that happened in my case. And another detective would say, well, in my case, the designated nurse went on a break. Lucy Letby was covering. And the detective would say, that happened in my case. And then you have all of these, what he called chilling overlaps, start to fall into place. So by the time all this is done, swipe data, medical notes, handwritten notes, typed notes, text messages, this incredibly complex Rubik's Cube of information. It's a year before they arrest Lucy Letby in 2018. They question her and let her go, release her on bail. At that point, as you said, search her home, search her parents' home, and they find a treasure trove of incredible, baffling, unbelievable information. You know, notes that she's written, handover sheets, scribbled notes on paper towels from where resuscitations had happened. We've spoken to lots and lots of nurses subsequently to this. Things that you'd never take home if you're a nurse because it just isn't done. Thousands of these sheets that should never have left the unit. But in addition, these notes that she had made, and you'll have seen them, I'm sure, by now, Post-it notes, green Post-it notes, yellow Post-it notes, you know, I am evil written on them. I did this. I'm not good enough. I'll never marry. I'll never have children. I'll never have a family. Angry. We had a handwriting expert look at these notes actually for us on the podcast, and they were angry, scribbled notes. You know, it had gone through the paper on the other side. Well, no one could explain the notes, really. In her defence, she said that she was just so devastated that she was being accused or thought of in these terms, that it was just her utter anguish coming out. One of the things that perplexed us was that in her house there was a shredder. We also know the police certainly believe that she knew they were investigating her because they'd spoken to all of her colleagues. And it begs the question, why would you not get rid of those notes if you had written them? Certainly the police would say, did she write them for us to find?
She is actually formally charged in 2020 and the trial started in October 2022. She has pleaded not guilty to all of the charges that are laid against her. She does take to the stand herself. Do we learn anything from her that might give us some insight as to why she did what she did?
Yes, she did. In fact, she was the main defence witness. There was nobody else. There was a plumber apart from that, and the plumber was talking about a possible infection on the ward because there was an issue with one of the sinks, some of the sinks on one of the units. So that was the only other defence witness, actually. She was the key defence witness and she did give evidence. We weren't sure whether she would. We thought she probably would, but she did. Yeah, so we learned a few things. We learned that she had been diagnosed with PTSD and hypervigilance and hypersensitivity, which she said was because of her arrest in 2018. Of course, she was arrested 2018, 2019, and then 2020 when she was charged. So 3 times that she was arrested and then charged with 22 offences. She was calm. She was controlled. Some people would say she lacked emotion. I would concur with that. I sat through that. She was very controlled, very calm. My colleague on the podcast, Liz Hull, was in court throughout, as were many of us, and said it was like you could hear her brain working out what to say. She often gave quite full answers, but obviously nothing when it was allegations put to her around why and when and how. She just would often say she couldn't remember, she didn't know, she couldn't recall. One of the things that we thought was really telling, actually, that we weren't allowed to say during the trial, but we talked about afterwards, was that in the UK, when you're asked to give evidence, the court assembles, the jury are there, the judge, the journalist, the public gallery, everyone is in court. And the person giving evidence then goes to the witness box or the stand and takes the oath and then starts their evidence. That is the normal way it's done here. In this case, she asked and was granted the permission to be in the witness box and take the stand before anybody else came into court, which I've never seen in 20 years of covering many, many court cases. I've never seen that. And some psychologists, criminologists have said that's a way of her controlling her environment. So she put that down to hypervigilance, hypersensitivity, PTSD, that she needed to be sitting in that witness box before everyone filed in. So we would come into court and she'd already be there. So that was quite an interesting dynamic in this case. And as I said, she was controlled, calm, and we heard that throughout the arrests as well. We heard that she was controlled and calm. It was certainly put to her that the only points at which she became upset were when the jury was shown pictures of her house or the pictures of cards from her relatives on her fridge, favourite auntie, or, things like that, where it was sort of about her own life, and where allegations of how these babies had suffered and died were put to her, she appeared to be lacking in any emotion in those moments.
I read that she did get quite emotional at one point and even tried to leave the courtroom when one of her colleagues took to the stand.
Yeah, so this was when she wasn't in the witness box. She was in the dock at this point, and Dr. A, as he was known in this trial, he is anonymous and we can't name him. He was asked to give evidence and he came into court. And at that point, yeah, you're right, she did. It was a really unusual outburst of emotion from her. She started to cry. She got up from her seat. She tried to leave the dock, not in a violent way, but she was anxious. She was concerned and she was upset. Obviously, the dock officers were with her. 3 dock officers were constantly with her. And her defence solicitor immediately had a very hushed conversation. The judge asked if she was okay to carry on, and she did. And the reason Dr. A is significant in this case was because she was very close to Dr. A. She was very friendly with him. The prosecution referred to him as her boyfriend. He's a married doctor. And certainly any allegation that they were having an affair was utterly refuted and utterly denied. But whatever their personal relationship, they were certainly incredibly close. They would text and talk into the early hours. He'd often give her lifts home throughout this whole period. They went on day trips shopping. They went to London for a day. Again, whatever their relationship, they were certainly very close. And one of the allegations as part of the trial was that Lucy Letby did a lot of this to create drama. She liked to be in the thick of it. She liked to be in there, involved in poorly babies, saving their lives, or being involved in, after they died, memory boxes and looking after parents and taking locks of hair and hand and footprints. And one of the allegations as part of the sort of drama side of it was that she wanted his attention. On a number of occasions, he was the consultant that was bleeped when babies were crashing. So it would be Dr. A that was crash bleeped to come and help save the lives of these babies. As I say, we don't know the nature of their relationship. He hasn't spoken to us after the trial, and we only can refer to him as Dr. A. But certainly they were, at the very least, incredibly close and good friends. And that would be the one rare moment of emotion that we witnessed from Lucy Letby when he came to give his evidence.
So Lucy Letby was found guilty of taking the lives of 7 babies. She is one of a very small group of women who've ever been handed a whole life sentence in the UK. What happens now? Does she get the right to appeal?
She absolutely does have a right to appeal, yes. She has 28 days from the conclusion of this trial to state whether there's going to be an appeal. So I'm I'm certain her defence barrister, Ben Myers, KC, and his team are now reviewing what they now want to do. There's absolutely no sense whatsoever that she's going to take responsibility at the moment. She has absolutely refuted all of these allegations against her. And as you say, she's one of only 4 women in the UK to be given whole life terms. Other ones are Myra Hindley, Rose West, and more recently, Joanna Dennehy. So yeah, she's a very select group, if you like, of prisoners who are serving whole life terms. And I should clarify, actually, she wasn't given one whole life term, Claire. She was given a whole life term for every single count that she was found guilty of. I'm certainly not aware of anyone being given a whole life term in the UK for attempted murder. But in this case, the judge gave her whole life terms for every single count that she was found guilty of. Clearly, it makes no difference to the outcome of how long she's in prison for. But it was a message from the judge to say, this is how utterly grim this was. This is how awful your crimes were. You were being given a whole life term for every single crime that this jury have found you guilty of. So yes, she will go to prison for the rest of her life. And obviously that has now started.
Thanks to Caroline for assisting us to tell this story. Her podcast, The Trial of Lucy Letby, is linked in our show notes if you'd like to take a listen. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Claire Murphy, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.